Hi everyone, and welcome back to Minds and Machines with me, Dr. Josh Redstone. So today what I'm going to try to do is wrap up our discussion of Aristotle's book, De Anima. A few quick housekeeping things before we get started though. I see that some of you have already begun to post your discussion points, questions, answers to questions, remarks, so on and so forth, on the discussion forums for week 3. So that's great. I'll probably get around to answering some questions and responding to some of these comments over the weekend. I just wanted to get this lecture finished and out of the way first. Also, I hope that you've all found the template for the critical responses. If you decide to use it, it should make things easier for you. You don't have to use it, but it's just going to be easier if you do. And if you don't use it, just make sure whatever format you submit your critical response or reading response in, it contains all of the necessary information like your name, my name, due date, course code, and that sort of thing. Okay? So, with that out of the way, let's get back into De Anima. Now, as I said, I'm going to try and keep this one a bit shorter in the interest of catching up. So I just want to do a little bit of recap of some of the differences between Plato and Aristotle, and then we're going to focus in on particular selections from De Anima, Book 3, that help give us more of an idea what Aristotle understands the soul to be. So let's get into this recap now. Now remember, Aristotle was a student of Plato's. He was a student at Plato's University, the Academy, but he did part ways with Plato, as we discussed last time when we looked at this image from the School of Athens by Raphael. Now, Plato and Aristotle both differed when it came to their account of what knowledge is, episteme, and they also differ quite significantly on what they think the soul or psyche is. I probably should have mentioned the soul is the psyche, the root of our word for psychology. Probably should have mentioned that before, but in any case, there you go. A couple of the things that I talked about before include that Plato sort of anticipates a philosophical movement called rationalism. Rationalism is basically the idea that knowledge comes from the mind. Either knowledge is innate or knowledge is purely deductive. Like you can come to know things by deduction, if you like. For example, if you tell me that Jones is a bachelor, I can deduce that he is single, right? That's deductive knowledge because definitionally, a bachelor is single, right? So knowledge for the rationalists is like this. It's either all a priori and that it can be known deductively or without sense experience, or it is innate. And that's, of course, what Plato is all about with his theory of recollection or anamnesis. Of course, Plato also anticipates a sort of dualism, and we'll encounter rationalism and dualism again next time when we begin to talk about the work of René Descartes. We'll see this mind-body dualism in his work as well. But Plato thought the mind or the soul, the psyche, was immortal, divine, immaterial. It was a form. It was part of the form of life. The body is just made of matter and it can decay and so forth. Aristotle parts ways here. Aristotle left the academy, spent some time studying the natural world, about a decade, and then started his own school, the Lyceum. During this time, Aristotle did a lot of biology and zoology, a lot of vivisection of animals and plants to learn about their organized bodies, that kind of thing. And remember, Aristotle anticipated a different movement, a movement that's kind of set in opposition to rationalism, and that is empiricism. Empiricism is the view that knowledge comes from the senses or sense experience. So here knowledge is a posteriori. It's something we have to learn about perhaps inductively or abductively, or just by observing something out in the world, right? Of course, another big part of Aristotle's metaphysics was his hylomorphism. You remember how the pre-Socratics were all about finding out what the fundamental substance that makes up everything is, the arche. And some said it was water, and some said it was atoms and void, and some said it was numbers or air, or all of the four fundamental elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Right? They all wanted to understand this primordial substance, or arche. A nice way of capturing hylomorphism is maybe to say that for Aristotle, this arche, this primordial substance, is matter and form together. That's one way you could look at this. And of course, Aristotle's understanding of the soul, the psyche, is much different from Plato's, as we've already talked about. What does Aristotle have to say about the soul? Well, we talked about this last time. We saw that Aristotle says things like, the soul is the cause or source of the living body. The terms cause and source have many senses, but the soul is the cause of the body alike in all three senses which we explicitly recognize. It is A, the source or origin of movement. It is B, the end, or telos. And C, it is the essence of the whole living body. So the form, or the soul, is the form of a living body. Elsewhere he writes, what is soul? An answer which applies to it in its full extent. It is substance in the sense which corresponds to the definitive formula of a thing's essence. That means that it is the essential whatness of a body of the character just assigned, an essentially organized body where each of the organs has a certain end, and the life form itself has a certain end or final cause as well, or purpose, if you like. So, very different. Of course, Plato does not think that the soul can exist without a body. That's one of the big ways he differs from Plato. But before we dive too deeply into exploring the nature of the rational soul, which is really what I want to do today, I want to just take a quick recap of some more of Aristotle's metaphysics. We'll talk a little bit more about his theory of causality, hylomorphism, and this idea of entelechy. So let's do that now. All right, just a few things I want to review here. Remember, firstly, hylomorphism, right? This idea, this term that Aristotelian scholars have come up with that means a kind of matter formism or matter formness, from hule or hyle, meaning matter, and morphe, meaning form. Hylomorphism is how Aristotle understands beings, right? In terms of in terms of fundamental substance, as I mentioned earlier, for Aristotle, it's matter and form together. Form is superior to matter because matter needs a form to have an end, to have a final cause, right? And these forms are also intelligible as universals, as mental concepts, as we might call them today, right? All matter also has this inner purpose or end. We call that entelechy, the final cause, and this is what gives matter the ability to have form. Matter can have an end which can allow it to have form, and giving the matter form is how that being can achieve its end, if that makes sense. And remember, to really understand something, to give a complete account of anything, according to Aristotle, you need to understand it in terms of four different causes. And remember, we're not talking about like billiard ball causation here. We're talking about something a little bit more complicated, a little more nuanced. Aristotle's four causes, just to recap, are the material cause. That's the matter, the stuff that something is made out of. There's the formal cause, which is the form it takes. There's the efficient cause. The efficient cause is what brings the thing into being. And there's the final cause, which is its end or purpose, or telos. So going back to the example of the table, its material cause is wood. Its formal cause is the form of a table, the intelligible form of a table. It was brought into being by a carpenter. and its final cause or its purpose is to have things placed on top of it and to sit on the floor thusly. So there you go, a little recap of Aristotle's theory of causality. Another important thing to really recap, because it can be a little bit tricky to grasp, I guess, if you're not used to Aristotelian metaphysics, is that for Aristotle, the soul is like the body's form, right? So form is to matter, if we're talking about Aristotle's causality. Form is to matter as the soul is to the body. Think of the example I drew from Shields's Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article. A lump of bronze, which is matter, it's a material cause, has the potential to be a statue. It has this entelechy, right? Has the potential to be a statue, but it needs a formal cause, as well as an efficient cause, and so on and so forth, to become an actual statue. Right? Likewise, any living being which is made of matter, if it is to be alive, needs a soul, which is the form of life, or this first principle of life. So, that can be a little tricky to wrap your head around, but a nice way of capturing it is the way that Lorenz captures it here. The soul for Aristotle is just a system of abilities possessed and manifested by animate bodies of suitable structure. So the soul, for Aristotle, isn't some kind of immaterial, thing that inhabits the body. It's not, as Gilbert Ryle would put it many, many centuries later, it's not as if the soul is a ghost in the machine. As if the body is a machine, the body is made of matter, and the soul is some kind of immaterial operator of the machine. That's certainly how Descartes, as we'll see next week, looked at it. It's a little bit like what Plato understood. The soul is in the body and kind of inhabits the body, but leaves the body at death. The body's not really a machine for Plato, but in any case, for Aristotle, the soul isn't like this at all. Rather, the soul is just the whole system of abilities that living being has, and all the things that living being does by virtue of its structure, its organized body. So the soul, life for Aristotle is something that matter does when suitably organized, when organized according to the proper form, the form of life, which is the soul. And this anticipates functionalism. Functionalism is, of course, the view that what makes something a something, what makes an A, is that it functions as an A. Think of an artificial heart, for example. An artificial heart is made of different material from a biological heart, but we still think of it as a heart. Why? Because this cybernetic implant pumping blood throughout your body is doing the same thing as a biological heart. So that would be like a functionalist understanding of a heart. Likewise with a mind. A mind for a functionalist would be anything that computes. Anything that's alive for a functionalist would be organized and perform the functions of living beings: nutrition, growth, reproduction, so on and so forth. So hopefully Lorenz's quote, the soul is a system of abilities possessed and manifested by animate bodies of suitable structure, with my little unpacking of it there, makes this a little bit more clear. Of course, we also spent a lot of time talking about the three parts of soul, right? So we talked about the nutritive soul, which all living creatures possess, even plants. And the nutritive soul is responsible for growth and reproduction. It is, responsible or enables beings to consume nutriment, to grow, to reproduce, and so on and so forth. So all living creatures have the nutritive soul. That's like the bare minimum, Aristotle says, for counting as alive. But there's also the sensitive soul, which animals have, but plants don't. The sensitive soul for Aristotle is what enables local movement, so moving around your environment, moving your arms and legs and going from place to place and interacting with objects in the environment. And of course, it also enables sensation. And as we saw last time, Aristotle thinks we only have 5 senses. And some animals, like humans, have all 5, whereas others have only 1, touch. And of course, some living beings have no senses, like plants, according to Aristotle. Finally, there's the rational soul, which is what I'd really like to talk about for the remainder of the lecture. And the rational soul, we call the mind or the intellect, or nous. That's the ancient Greek term for intellect, nous. It's what enables us to use our logos, our reason, our proper thinking, our good reasoning, our logos. And this is something that Aristotle thought was unique to humans, and it might be the only part of the soul, according to Aristotle, that is actually immortal and imperishable. So the intellect, or nous, is the part of the rational soul which might be able to exist without a body. But there's been a lot of debate about that over the centuries. But we'll take a look at why that's a possibility for Aristotle today. So I'm just going to focus mostly on Book 3 for this lecture, and I'm only going to focus on certain passages, certain parts, which you, again, go and look up yourself if you want to read them through again. Anyway, how does Aristotle start Book 3? Well, in parts 1 and 2 of Book 3, Aristotle continues to talk about the senses, why they were only 5, and how the sense organs actually work, or how he thought they work. Aristotle is of the view that things that we perceive come to us through a medium like air or water, and that our sense organs work because they're made of similar elements, or really the same elements as the things as the medium or the media that we're looking at, that our sense organs are receiving. So it's kind of a very antiquated view of how perception works, but it's interesting. But we're not going to spend too much time talking about that. In part 3, Aristotle discusses the imagination, and he discusses how the imagination differs from perception. And here we can see a little bit more of the foreshadowing of empiricism that Aristotle is responsible for. Remember, empiricism is the view that knowledge comes from the senses. Aristotle says of the senses and of perception, "For perception of the special objects of sense is always free from error, and is found in all animals, while it is possible to think falsely as well as truly, and thought is found only where there is discourse of reason as well as sensibility." So what Aristotle is saying here is that the senses don't mislead us, right? For Aristotle, the senses are how we come to grasp the sensible forms of beings in the world, right? So our senses don't mislead us, and he says they're always free from error. A very strong claim that is definitely wrong. I mean, our senses do deceive us sometimes. Sometimes our sense organs break down. So Aristotle's making a bit of a strong claim here, a bit too strong. But the point I want to emphasize is that this is very different from Plato. Here he's saying thought is only found where there is discourse of reason as well as sensibility. We can only think about things if we have things to think about. How do we get that? From our senses. It's how we get the sensible forms, how we apprehend the sensible forms of beings in the world. Now, there's more here about thinking, too. What does Aristotle have to say about what thinking is? Thinking is what the intellect does. Nous is what nous is what thinks. It's the part of the rational soul that thinks. So what does Aristotle have to say about that? Well, one thing he says is this. He says, "The thinking part of the soul must therefore be, while impassible, capable of receiving the form of an object, that is, must be potentially identical in character with its object without being the object. Mind must be related to what is sensible, as sense is to what is sensible. So, what's he saying here? Your mind is not the things it's thinking about, but in a way, it becomes the things it's thinking about. You apprehend the form, the sensible forms of the objects that you perceive with your sense organs. So these forms, these sensible forms, are what are thinkable, just like the objects of sense are what are sensible. But interestingly, as I mentioned last time, and as I'll talk about toward the end of this lecture, Aristotle does not tie the intellect to an organ the way he ties our senses to our sense organs, which again probably strikes us as really weird given all we know about the brain nowadays. So Aristotle says, thus that in the soul, which is called mind, by mind I mean what whereby the soul thinks and judges, is, before it thinks, not actually any real thing. For this reason, it cannot reasonably be regarded as blended with the body. If so, it would acquire some quality, for example, warmth or cold, or even have an organ like the sensitive faculty. As it is, it has none. So here Aristotle's talking about the mind as this sort of incorporeal thing that just, he says it's not actually any real thing. It's not a real thing, but it can take into it the sensible forms of things in the world. But it doesn't take on the qualities of these things itself, right? If you think about something hot, the mind doesn't actually become hot, right? So the mind can't be an actual thing. And it's not, as I said, tied to an organ. It's not associated with an organ like the organs of our sense faculties are associated with organs. So for this reason, Aristotle thinks that at least before the mind is thinking about anything, it's not really a real thing. And all it does when it's thinking is sort of work with the forms that it's apprehended, if you like. Aristotle continues, talking about the intellect, observation of the sense organs and their employment reveals a distinction between the impassibility of the sensitive and that of the intellective faculty. After strong stimulation of a sense, we are less able to exercise it than before, as, for example, in the case of a loud sound, we cannot hear easily immediately after, or in the case of a bright color or a powerful odor, we cannot see or smell. But in the case of mind, thought about an object that is highly intelligible renders it more and not less able afterwards to think objects that are less intelligible. The reason is that while the faculty of sensation is dependent upon the body, mind is separable from it. So there you have it. It seems that the intellect is an exception to this idea that the soul cannot live without the body. At least for Aristotle, the intellect is a part of soul that isn't really tied to the body, isn't really a physical thing, okay? What else does Aristotle have to say here? Well, he goes on, once the mind has become each set of its possible objects, when it's learning and thinking is how I read this, as a man of science has, when this phrase is used of one who is actually a man of science, this happens when he is now able to exercise the power on his own initiative, its condition is still one of potentiality, but in a different sense from the potentiality which preceded the acquisition of knowledge by learning or discovery. The mind, too, is then able to think itself. So, very interesting, very abstract. What's Aristotle saying here? Well, in the first paragraph, Aristotle is again differentiating between the intellect and the senses. He says of the senses, if we hear a very loud noise, it's almost like it blunts our senses. You hear a loud noise, you can't hear very well for a little while after. If you see a really bright light, you can't see as well after. But if you think about something really like highly intelligible, you're not less able to think about it after. If you learn a really hard subject, for example, easier subjects become even easier to learn about. for example. So that's one of the ways that Aristotle is saying the intellect is different from sensation, and sensation is obviously depending on the body. These two quotes are a little bit obscure, admittedly, even to me, but I wonder if I can make any sense of them now. This is, again, continuing to talk about the rational soul. Aristotle writes, "Since we can distinguish between a spatial magnitude and what it is to be such, and between water and what it is to be water, and so in many other cases, though not in all, for in certain cases the thing and its form are identical," like for example a perfect triangle, "flesh and what it is to be flesh are discriminated by either by different faculties or by the same faculty in two different states. For flesh necessarily involves matter and is like what is snub-nosed." Not exactly sure what that means. "Now it is by means of the sensitive faculty that we discriminate the hot and the cold. That is, the factors which combine in a certain ratio constitute flesh. The essential character of flesh is apprehended by something different, either wholly separate from the sensitive faculty or related to it as a bent line to the same line when it has been straightened out." He continues, "Again, in the case of abstract objects, what is straight is analogous to what is snub-nosed, for it necessarily implies a continuum as its matter. Its constitutive essence is different, if we may distinguish between straightness and what is straight. Let us take it to be two-ness. It must be apprehended, therefore, by a different power or by some power in a different state. To sum up, insofar as the realities it knows are capable of being separated from their matter, so it is also with the powers of mind." So this is what the mind is doing, taking the sensible forms and separating it from the matter, right? And that's how we kind of understand things in the world and how we give the mind something to think about. All right, rather than continuing to talk about that, let's get on to another more important quote where Aristotle introduces another really big empiricist idea, and that is the mind as a tabula rasa. This is Latin for blank tablet or blank slate or uninscribed tablet, if you like. The tabula rasa is a big idea in empiricist philosophy. So, for example, the empiricist philosopher from the modern period, John Locke, thought that the mind was a tabula rasa at birth. The mind is a blank slate at birth, and all knowledge comes from sense experience. We kind of inscribe on that tablet as we grow up and learn. Aristotle, however, was the first philosopher to introduce this idea of the mind as a blank tablet. But he means blank tablet or uninscribed tablet in a slightly different way than John Locke would mean when he said it. The mind is a blank slate hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later. So, for example, Aristotle writes here in this famous uninscribed tablet passage, "Have not we already disposed of the difficulty about interaction involving a common element when we said that the mind is in a sense potentially whatever is thinkable, though actually it is nothing until it has thought? What it thinks must be in it just as characters may be said to be on a writing tablet, on which as yet nothing actually stands written. This is exactly what happens with mind. Mind isn't really anything until it's thinking something. It's an uninscribed tablet until it begins to think, until it has some objects of thought to think with. And these are like the characters that get written on a tablet." So Aristotle continues, "Mind is itself thinkable in exactly the same way as its objects are. For in the case of objects which involve no matter, what thinks and what is thought are identical, for speculative knowledge and its object are identical. Why mind is not always thinking we must consider later." A little sidebar there from Aristotle. "In the case of those which contain matter, each of the objects of thought is only potentially present. It follows that while they will not have mind in them, for mind is a potentiality for them only insofar as they are capable of being disengaged from matter, minds may yet be thinkable." So again, I realize this is very abstract and probably very strange sounding uh, if you're someone who's used to thinking of the mind in the way that we've thought about it in the 20th and 21st centuries. But the mind for Aristotle is like this uninscribed tablet. It isn't anything until it starts to think, but it can think about objects of thought, those are thinkable, and the mind can also think about itself. It is itself thinkable. Think about it. You can think about your own thoughts, something that we now call metacognition. So this is very abstract, but don't worry too much. The key thing I want to drive home here is Aristotle's introduction of what would later become a big empiricist theme. The mind is an uninscribed tablet. The mind isn't anything until it thinks. All right, so all of that stuff was pretty much drawn from part three part four of book three. In part five, Aristotle introduces another important couple of ideas which have been taken up by scholars of Aristotelian philosophy. These ideas are the active or agent intellect and the passive or possible intellect. So there's another division in the functions of soul here for Aristotle. A division between the active or agent intellect and the passive or possible intellect. What are these? Well, Aristotle explains here, since in every class of things, as in nature as a whole, we find two factors involved. One, a matter which is potentially all the particulars included in the class, and two, a cause which is productive in the sense that it makes them all, the latter standing to the former as, for example, an art to its material. These distinct elements must likewise be found within the soul. So think back to hylomorphism again. Aristotle is talking about matter and form here again. The matter which has all these potentialities in it, this entelechy, right? This potential to be something, and a formal cause, an art to its material kind of relationship, right? Aristotle is saying there has to be something like this in the intellect as well. And that's the active or agent intellect and the passive or possible intellect. The active intellect or the agent intellect is the form of thought, the form of the intellect, the formal cause of mind or mentation, if you like. And the passive or possible intellect is like a store. It's like the symbols that are written on the tablet that we mentioned earlier, right? The words, letters, numbers, whatever we're writing on the tablet. That's like the possible intellect, a store of concepts, mental items, universals. This is the material or the matter of thought, if you like, for Aristotle. Aristotle continues, and in fact, mind, as we have described it, is what it is by virtue of becoming all things, while there is another which is what it is by virtue of making all things. This is a sort of positive state like light, for in a sense, light makes potential colors actual colors. So here Aristotle is saying something like, the passive intellect is what receives the intelligible forms of things, what stores the intelligible forms of things. This is what's written on our tablet of the mind, right? The active intellect, on the other hand, comes in and makes that knowledge of stuff, knowledge of the intelligible forms held in the passive intellect, which is merely potential knowledge. The active intellect brings that into actuality and makes it actual knowledge, allows us to actually do things, to actually think and therefore do things. It's another thing I thought of, I probably should have mentioned about Aristotle in the previous lecture, is he was a very practically minded philosopher, where Plato's talking about the form of the good and knowledge of the good and this kind of thing. Aristotle's talking about living the good life, for example, as a skill you have to practice. Same with knowledge. Knowledge is something we practice, right? It's knowledge, and knowing is something we do. Remember, this is a function of the soul, and the soul is part of a form of life, a form of a living body. So for Aristotle, the mind is very much something active, something that does things. The active intellect, again, takes that potential knowledge from the passive intellect and turns it into actual knowledge, in the same way that light makes potential colors into actual colors. And I mention this quote for another reason, because we'll see next time when we read Descartes that this association with between light and thinking and reason and knowledge becomes a very big theme in the modern period. You'll hear Descartes talk about the natural light of reason. Reason being this thing that illuminates the darkness and shows us the way the world is, leads us to the truth, right? So that's another reason I wanted to mention that quote. And it does anticipate the whole, science as a candle in the dark and reason as this sort of natural light, right? So just keep that stuff in mind as we move forward next week and take a look at René Descartes, our first modern philosopher. So, to try and tie everything together, the rational soul has, the mind or the intellect, the part of the soul or psyche that thinks by virtue of, nous, the intellect. Can it exist separately from the body? Well, Aristotle views the soul as, the form of a living body, right? The soul is like all of the functions, all of the things, the abilities possessed and manifested by a living body, right? So the soul, for Aristotle, is not something that can exist without a body. That is, at least when it comes to the nutritive soul and the sensitive soul. But Aristotle does seem to think that perhaps the intellect, or nous, part of the rational soul, can exist without a body. And there are many arguments, many interpretations of Aristotle on why this is arguably the case. And we've encountered some of Aristotle's own reasoning here as well. Remember, Aristotle does not tie the intellect or associate the intellect with an organ like he does with the senses. The senses all have their accompanying organs. For sight, we have eyes. For hearing, we have ears, and so forth. But Aristotle doesn't think we have an organ for thinking. He didn't know or didn't imagine that that's precisely what the brain is. But in any case, because of that, Aristotle thinks that the intellect can exist without a body. So the rational soul, or at least the intellect part of the rational soul, which seems like a pretty important part of it, can exist without a body. There are other arguments as well. Aristotle says that our sense organs never make mistakes, which again, he's probably wrong about, but he argues that our sense organs don't lead us to make errors, but we can think incorrect thoughts. So since our sense organs don't make errors when we're sensing all the sensible objects in our world, and they're tied to organs, but we can think incorrect thoughts, there must not be an organ that always makes us think the right way, in the same way that there are sense organs that never fail us and always make us perceive the world the right way. Come on, Aristotle. Like, obviously the senses deceive us sometimes, but in any case, that's one of the ways Aristotle has been interpreted here by scholars, Aristotelian scholars. And by the way, this whole idea of the intellect being immaterial and not attached to the body and being this thing that can think itself is probably related to Aristotle's understanding of God. Aristotle's got, like Plato, a kind of understanding of God as the God of the philosophers, right? Not as Zeus sitting on Olympus hurling lightning bolts. It's much more similar to the Judeo-Christian Islamic understanding of God, like an omnipotent, omnipresent kind of God. And we don't have time to get into this today, but for Aristotle, God is like a prime mover or an unmoved mover, a kind of being of pure mind, like God is like mind itself. Very interesting conception of the divine from Aristotle. But I think his understanding of the rational soul or the intellect, nous, is probably related to his understanding of God. But that is far beyond the scope of this class. But, it's interesting to be aware of. I mean, this is why Aristotle has had such a big influence throughout the years. From the end of antiquity through the Dark Ages, early Christian thinkers and later Christian thinkers, all the way to the modern period, used Aristotle's philosophy to try and give an account based on reason of what Christianity had to say about the soul. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas were very big into Aristotelian philosophy. Thomas Aquinas, who was a monk during the Dark Ages, spent a lot of time studying Aristotle, and Aristotle's work was so important, he just called Aristotle the philosopher. Right? That's how important Aristotle was for Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas, thought, well, the Bible says a lot about the soul and God, but it doesn't really give us a reason-based account of all this stuff. And he found that in Aristotle. So did Middle Eastern thinkers during the Islamic Golden Age. When Europe was in the Dark Ages, Plato and Aristotle and all that stuff was being read in the Islamic world at the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. And Islamic scholars used Aristotle's philosophy to try and understand aspects of the soul and aspects of the divine as well. So that's also very interesting. So if you're interested in these kinds of elements of intellectual history, send me an email. Maybe I can point you in the direction of some interesting stuff to read. Well, I suppose we better wrap it up. I don't have a summary slide on this set of slides. Probably should have prepared one, but in the interest of getting things done, I suppose I must have neglected that. But we spent a lot of time talking about the rational soul today, at least Aristotle's understanding of the rational soul, something special that humans have in addition to the nutritive and sensitive souls. The rational soul is not associated with an organ of thought. It's probably immaterial. It kind of becomes its own objects of thought and can think itself. I know that sounds weird, but that's okay. The rational soul also has the active and passive intellect. The passive intellect is like our store of potential knowledge, things that we can write on that blank slate. And the active intellect is what brings that into actual knowledge, because knowing, thinking, these are things we do. They are functions of soul, functions of the intellectual part of the soul, nous, according to Aristotle. So that's it. Again, if you haven't already read this, just go back and look at the points I've directed you to here, because it is dense reading this Aristotle stuff. And next time I teach this class, I'll probably just take selections out ahead of time so that no one has to read the entire thing. But in any case, for next time, what will we do next time? So for next time, I'm going to summarize a little bit of what we learned so far. A very quick summary of the ancients' view of the soul, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Then I'll provide a bit of background on the next philosopher that we're going to talk about, and that is René Descartes, who was an early modern philosopher, mathematician, all-around scholar of philosophy, religion, mathematics, all kinds of stuff. And we're going to take a look at his work. I'm going to set the stage like I did previously by talking a little bit about the modern age and what kinds of things were going on in the world at that time. And then we'll begin looking at Descartes' book, Meditations on First Philosophy. Now, I don't want to overwhelm you with reading, so for now, just read Meditations 1 and 2. There's a link in the slides. I'll place a link in the description of this video as well. And of course, the reading is already linked for my students on See You Learn. So just read the first two meditations, and we will discuss Meditations 1 and 2 next time, after we've kind of summarized what we've learned about the ancient views of the soul and set the stage and learned a little bit about the world that René Descartes finds himself in. All right, so that's all for today. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll begin replying to your discussion points on the discussion board over the weekend. In the meantime, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you all next time. All right, bye for now, everyone.